Coffee Center. My name is Robert Pine. I'm program director here. And I am very pleased to welcome you and my friend Ryan Martin here, the anger professor, not the angry professor, but the anger professor. So Professor Martin is Dean of the College of Arts. I have to read this because it's long. I mean, this is like a two-breath job title. He's Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, and Professor of Psychology. That's a lot to get on a card. It's a long title. He's trained as a counseling psychologist at University of Southern Mississippi. He's worked in clinical settings in community mental health centers, college counseling centers, and a VA hospital. He has 2 books out, at least that I have seen and read. The first is Why We Get Mad, How to Use Your Anger for Positive Change. And the most recent, How to Deal with Angry People. We've got at least one retired politician in our midst who knows how to, we probably should have gotten you a copy of How to Deal with Angry People about a decade ago, right?
Even though I'm retired, I still learn.
Okay. So Brian is a member of our affiliate faculty here at the Monty Center, which means that every month we have gathered for a dinner, a meal, and conversation around a book. Last night we were talking about his books, and so got a little bit of a preview. And all day today I've been thinking of more questions that I want to ask him, because this is a lively topic and one that actually it inspires a continuing curiosity, even from our speaker. I've come to know him as somebody who is kind, truly, and humble. He didn't pay me to say that, it's true. Super smart, obviously, but eager to engage with questions. This is one of my favorite traits of Ryan, is that he will entertain questions and talk and explore. And I know that we're going to have a chance to do that tonight. So I'm pleased for the intimate size of our group, because it means that we're going to have a chance to have really good interaction. I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful to Ryan Martin for taking an evening tonight to talk to us about anger. So Ryan, welcome.
That was just such a delightful introduction. Thank you. And I really enjoyed this this year of getting to get to know Bob and work with him and be part of the affiliate group, which is more than anything an opportunity to eat great food and hang out with really good people and talk. So I've been very thankful for that. Yeah, so you know, as was alluded to, I've been studying anger for a very long time. It is interestingly though, and I want to comment on something. It is, maybe it's weird to have a favorite emotion, but I do. And anger is my favorite emotion to study and to think about and to talk about and to learn from other people about. But interestingly, Bob actually highlighted, I think unknowingly in his intro, my second favorite emotion, which is curiosity. I am an extraordinarily curious person, and one of the reasons I am that way, and one of the reasons I value curiosity so much, is because I actually believe that curiosity is one of the solutions to our anger problem. That people who are interested in getting to know other people, people who want to learn, people who want to better understand other people, are much less likely to be angry. And so curiosity is a little bit of an antidote to a lot of modern problems. I'm also going to start out just by saying that this is, so I hope you perceive this as a good thing, but this is actually the first time I've done this talk. And the reason it's the first time I've done this talk is because it's kind of a brand new interest of mine. And I'll share more about that story and how it became an interest as we go. But ultimately, I've become a little bit obsessed over the last 6 months or so with male anger. And I've become really concerned about what I'm seeing in a variety of places, about a lot of data that is that I'm seeing, and a lot of stories that I'm hearing. And I want to start with something really interesting, because I've been talking a lot about this over social media and in other places that I write. And I'm hearing some interesting patterns coming up, and I kind of want to start out by just offering I guess some caveats right out of the gate. First is one of the first things people tell me is, hey, men have been angry for a long time, this isn't new. And there's of course some truth to that. We've known that there's some evidence for that. What we've seen in the past though has less a difference in the frequency with which men and women get angry. But what we've seen much more regularly is differences in the expression, meaning men tend to express their anger outwardly and women tend to suppress their anger or control their anger. What we're seeing now is actually a little different than that. What we seem to be seeing, and what makes this, I think, a modern social crisis in my mind, is that men are simply reporting being angry much more often than they used to be. And I think there's some reasons for that we're going to talk about. So that's one of the caveats that I had. The other is I want to, I guess I want to, one of the hard parts about having this conversation, and so almost everything I've written in the last 3 months has started with the disclaimer that this is not about shaming. This is not about identifying people and saying, hey, look at all these angry men, isn't it terrible? They just need to shape up, right? That isn't the goal. In fact, my hope here is to actually to better understand, again, what I think is a pretty serious problem, and to try and offer some empathy and to think through solutions collectively. And so I think it's really important that we kind of start through that lens. Or it's important to me that I start looking through that lens, and that I try and say that right out of the gate, because I think it's really important. So I've been collecting data on a website that I have for the last 4 or 5 years through something called the Anger Project. And so this data set now has 16,000 participants who from all over the country who participated in this survey. And I want to share some of the data right out of the gate here, that what we're seeing in this data is that men are reporting getting angry far more often than women. Now, this is self-report, and people point out to me regularly all the limitations there, and they are right, there are limitations to self-report data. But the question is quite simply, how often are you getting angry? And here's what we're seeing. So, and this didn't come through quite as well, but basically what you can see is that men are saying they get angry at least one time. 60% of men say they get angry at least once per day. Actually, this green right here, you probably can't read that, but it's a few times a day. So what we're seeing is the vast majority of men, 60% of men, are getting angry at least once a day, compared to just 38% of women who are reporting that. So the other piece too is, as you can tell, is that almost half of men are saying they're getting angry a few times a day. That they're ultimately experiencing pretty regular anger. And this is different than something we've seen in the past. In the past, these data were pretty similar. We didn't necessarily see this significant increase. So that's right at the start of a concern. It indicates something is going on. And by the way, I should mention too, the survey starts out by defining anger for people. It starts out by differentiating it from other types of emotions. So we're really trying to control for any of those sort of differences in perception or how people think about the emotion. Now, one thing I should probably do that for you all too. When I talk about anger, what I am, or how we define anger is as an emotion. It's the feeling state, and it's defined as the emotional desire, essentially, of having been wronged and wanting to lash out. Now, what you need to note there, though, is that you aren't necessarily lashing out, you want to. And so you don't have to act on that feeling. It's different. The feeling is different from many of the behaviors associated with it. So aggression would be a behavior where you are where you have an intent to hurt someone or something. And aggression can be verbal, it can be physical, it can be direct, it can be indirect. So like spreading rumors about people with the intent to hurt them, that's, verbal indirect aggression, right? It's like I'm trying to hurt this person, so I'm gonna say bad things about them. Maybe that's motivated by anger. Might also be motivated by some sort of secondary gain. Maybe you want their job, right? And so you're trying to spread bad rumors about they're trying to hurt them in that way because you want this thing, not necessarily because you're mad at them. So, before we go on, questions about this data? We use this as a chance to get a drink. Yeah, Bob.
So,
I can,
reuse the microphone.
and if other people have questions, I can repeat them too.
So you say that men are now reporting getting angry much more than they did previously. What might this have looked like, say, 10 years ago, 15 years ago?
Yep, so interestingly, it was still what we would have seen is, most people saying once a day, or approximately that many people saying once a day. It's what we would have seen is the numbers were more equal between men and women. And then also we wouldn't have seen as many people saying multiple times per day. I think that's one of the bigger distinctions. So typically when we've collected or looked at this data in the past, it's anywhere from, some people saying a few times a week to once a day. So the number just seems more for both. So, yeah.
Have the numbers for women stayed relatively stable in the last 10, 15 years? Or?
A great question. I'm not sure. Part of the challenge that we have with this is that, so I haven't been collecting this data for the last 15 years, unfortunately, so we don't have the capacity to look back that way. We do, so I end up comparing this to other studies that were done. There's a real famous study that was done, but a long time ago, in the 90s, that looked at this. And ultimately, I'd have to look back to see how different it was. If there's a thing that I could go back and just change, I wish we had sort of a thermometer, like an anger barometer that measured things over time that would allow us to look at this more directly, to get a sense for these questions more consistently. So here's what I think is also particularly interesting. The same survey asks questions about consequences. So what are you doing when you're angry? Because anger itself is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it oftentimes is a good thing. It's oftentimes really reasonable. But what you might be doing when you're angry could cause harm. And here's what we see when it comes to some of the common consequences of anger. Men are more likely to, and some of these might not surprise you, but they're more likely to get into a physical fight. They're more likely to get into a verbal fight. They're more likely to get into an online fight. They are more likely to damage a relationship, probably through one of those fights, but not necessarily. There's lots of ways to damage relationships when you're angry. And sometimes it's by getting so mad that you ghost someone and you don't continue a relationship with them. Or it might be that you unintentionally scare people in your life by yelling or screaming, things like that. So, but men are more likely to do that. They're more likely to accidentally or intentionally damage property. They're more likely to drive dangerously or aggressively. We talk a lot about road rage, obviously, and this is another thing we've seen is that road rage is that's supposed to happen.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay. Speaking of things that make you angry, we had our alarm went off in campus today, and did you enjoy this as well?
Yeah, that was
it just kept saying, thank you for this test. You can now return to your activities. It went on for a solid 20 minutes of telling us that this is just on repeat for a while. Yeah. So, which also felt like a test, but,
Did that make you angry?
you know, it felt, honestly, it felt a little dystopian. I was like, this is like what sci-fi movies in the future are like. This is, when we talk a lot about driving dangerously, or when we talk about aggression while driving, that can look a lot of different ways. We get kind of hyper focused on a lot of the real overt examples of aggressive driving, meaning like someone, you know, people get out of the car and get into a fight, people follow each other to their destination, they might bump someone with their car, etc. But actually what happens far more than that is people just drive really poorly when they're angry. They speed, they run red lights, they change lanes erratically, they drive up on a bumper of the person in front of them. So they drive dangerously in those cases and might accidentally have problems there. Men are also more likely to use a drug when they are angry, and that includes alcohol or nicotine, that they're more likely to do. So all of these problems that are occurring, and one of the things that I think is really important to note along is that almost all of these consequences included the suffering of some other person. With anger, because it's what we call a social emotion, it occurs within the context of relationships. And what that means is that the people in those relationships with you, they're victims, right? The physical or verbal and online fights have victims. The relationship damage obviously has victims. Driving potentially leads to these kinds of consequences. Yeah.
Do you not want questions during your?
Oh.
Is that okay?
I'm happy to take them.
Because about a year ago, there was, and I'm not, oh, excuse me. I'm not certain about what state this was, but there were two, someone, I guess, cut somebody off. And they both pulled over, and this guy got out of the car. And he proceeded to put like 4 in this guy's chest.
Yep.
And, you know, he shot this other guy and killed him. And it turned out both of these guys were successful businessmen. And I mean, they weren't, you know, like you consider them a lot of times down and out. And I'm wondering too about the escalation of violence having to do with the fact that we got so many bloody guns in this country.
Yep. So there's 2 points there. One is, so we've seen driving related shootings. We've seen increases in those. Drastic increases since 2020 in particular. So each year has gotten more and more dangerous that way. The other thing we'd say is that we know, I mean, there's 2 ways in which having a gun in the car influences this. One is the opportunity that you're describing. If there's no gun, then you know that's a fight, right? It turns into something. And frankly, the other piece of data we have is called the weapons effect. Is that having a gun present makes you more likely to get angry in a particular situation. So this is a study that was actually done by a guy named Brad Bushman, who is a researcher. They've done a couple versions of this, but one of these was actually in a car where they at Ohio State, they have this really cool sort of car driving simulator setup. And they did the research in the car, left a gun on the front seat, and saw that people who were driving in there were more likely to get angry, more likely to drive aggressively and dangerously. So having a gun actually makes you more likely to get mad in those situations. So I think you're right that the presence of guns exacerbates things. So this is a worry, right? I mean, what we're seeing again here is we've got one demographic, much angrier, much more likely to experience these consequences as a result of it. And then one of the questions I ask is essentially, well, what types of situations tend to lead to anger? So essentially, why are you getting angry? As a psychologist, I was trained not to ask why questions because they make people sound defensive. Or sorry, they sound offensive to people. So I get, sometimes I panic. No, so the question essentially, why? Why are you getting angry? And there's 3 categories. We're going to talk about these more in depth in a second, but there's these 3 categories that led to, or that people tend to get angry about. The first is poor treatment. The second is when they witness or experience injustice. And then the third is when they don't get something they want. And so, when you look at how people responded to this, men and women were essentially the same on poor treatment. They both said, I don't, when I'm treated poorly, I get angry. Men and women were essentially the same on injustice, though it is interesting, this is the one place where women are higher than men. So injustice was a biggie for both groups. Where you see a pretty significant gap is in when I don't get something I want, when my goals are blocked. And this dovetails with what I hear from many, many, many people in their personal experiences. What they tell me is when they run into male anger, it's when men don't get something they want. And so what seems like is happening, and we'll unpack this a little bit more fully in a moment, is that entitlement seems to be driving a lot of this anger. Entitlement drives all anger, because, and for reasons we'll get to, but it seems like that might be one of the big elements here. So I'm going to back up and tell you a little story about what got me interested in this. And it's, if it gets boring, I'll stop. I'm not saying this in any way to try and be divisive, but it's an important part of the narrative. It probably isn't too surprising to people, but I was a Harris supporter going into this election. And the election, the results surprised me. Maybe they shouldn't have, but I wasn't expecting what happened. And the next day, I, like a lot of people, was trying to figure out how this happened, right? And I'm scrolling through TikTok, and I came across a guy who I had seen many, many times before, but didn't necessarily know his name. And he's, anyways, his name is Scott Galloway, and he's a podcaster and professor at NYU. And he was talking about it. He said something that sort of blew my mind. He said, we were expecting this election to be about women's anger and women's right to choose. We were expecting it to be about that. It turns out it wasn't about that. It turns out it was actually about young men's anger. And that young men who rejected progressive or liberal, the liberal vision of masculinity in favor of a more conservative vision of masculinity. And it said, and they are mad. They're mad about where their lives are. They're mad about the experiences they're having. They're mad that it's hard to get a job. They're mad that it's hard to get a girlfriend. They're mad about all these different things. And it kind of, a couple things. One, it speaks to that entitlement that I was just talking about. It also, it hit me like just a ton of bricks to sort of realize that this thing that ultimately is pretty obvious in retrospect as I think about it, that it was kind of off my radar the way it was. And part of the reason why this matters to me is because I've been talking about anger online for, I mean, over a decade. I've been particularly well followed on Instagram and TikTok for the last 4 years, and 85% of my followers are women. When I wrote my first book, I was told, who is the audience? We were talking about with the marketing team, who's the audience? And what they told me is, you should be thinking of your audience as women. And I thought, really? And they said, yeah. So women who want to help their partners, women who want to help their sons. That there's this acknowledgement that the people who might need help the most aren't interested in that help. They're not listening. And then on top of that, and this is the part that really hit me pretty hard, is that on top of that, I think I had been unintentionally alienating that. I think at a certain point, I realized that that group was, what the pattern was, I would do a post on social media. A bunch of women would like it, a bunch of men would say stuff I'm not gonna repeat here, and I would fight back, right? I would, instead of trying to learn, instead of embracing that curiosity I mentioned at the beginning and trying to learn from them, trying to better understand them, try to get a feel, try to have a conversation, I would push back, I would argue. And this is the danger of social media too, is that all of that arguing, all that fighting, it made me more popular, right? And so it drove the algorithm and made me more successful. And so, you know, you keep doing that. And so I had this sort of moment where I realized, yikes, I haven't really been trying to reach the audience that I need to reach, and the audience that's important to me. Hence, I think what I consider a pretty big switch in how I'm trying to work and how I'm trying to operate and how I'm trying to reach people. I'm going to share some research with you, and then I'm going to tell you one other story that I think is, like, maybe I'll save it for the end just for keeping on your toes, curiosity, right? Keeps you focused. All right, so here's a couple of things that we know about the way anger plays a role in politics. So first of all, the angrier you are, the more likely you are to engage in politics. And this shouldn't come as too much of a surprise that if you're scrolling through Facebook and you see an ad that makes you angry, you click on it. You're twice as likely to click on it, actually. And so, but that's not surprising, but just take a moment to think about what that means from the politician's perspective. It means that they're incentivized to make you mad, right? Their ad becomes twice as financially viable if they make you angry, because you're twice as likely to click on it. So we know that this is a strategy, and we know it's a successful one. So it drives political interest. It's not the only thing that drives political interest, but it drives political interest. We also know that online, anger spreads faster than any other emotion. You are, when you're, this researcher looked at 4 different types of content to see what would be spread, what was most likely to be spread. Stuff that made you happy, stuff that made you sad, stuff that made you scared, or stuff that made you angry. What they found is you're likely to share happy stuff if you know the person who shared it. Like if you're scrolling through and you say, hey, Adam's got great news, this is cool. And then you might share that because you know that person, right? You're likely, you're not very likely to share stuff that makes you sad or scared, much less so. And then you're very likely to share stuff that makes you mad. And that will make up whether you know that person or not. So anger is the most viral emotion online, which again incentivizes people to use it against you. Right? It incentivizes, and not just politicians, it incentivizes journalists to write headlines that are going to make you angry. You know, we talk all the time about clickbait, right? Headlines that make you curious, but that's not nearly as powerful as headlines that make you mad. And trying to get people to share that. Let's see. We also know that people who are angry are more likely to share misinformation online. So when you are, and the way they do these studies is they literally, they bring people into a laboratory, they do a mood induction, meaning that they like find a way to make them mad in the moment. And then they look to see, you know, what are you likely to share? Are you likely to look for, to find out if it's true before you share it, do anything like that. And they find that people who are angry are much more likely to share misinformation. And then finally, people who are angry are more likely to believe conspiracy theories. So they're more likely to believe things like some of these different conspiracy theories. This is not something that you'll have a lot of success with if you try and talk about it on the internet, by the way. Very hard, very hard to convince people on the internet that they believe conspiracy theories. However, one thing that makes this study particularly interesting is that, because what a lot of people told me when I shared this research was, well, they're mad because all those conspiracy theories turned out to be true. And so it's very hard to argue with. And so and so then I asked for examples and I got lots of examples and I said, well, but here's the thing. This study actually made up a conspiracy. It was something that categorically did not happen. And they did the mood induction thing, and then they asked people, do you believe this, you know, and people believe it. They're more likely to believe it if they've been made angry first. So, by the way, when I shared that part, at least a handful of people came and said, well, how do you know it didn't happen? Because they made it up. So this is bad. I mean, this is bad for democracy, right? What we have is a situation where we've got misinformation spreading very quickly and people believing that misinformation, all driven by this emotion. And then when you add to it that we've got so many, you know, a higher percentage of angry men, we see this all sort of driving this kind of political rage machine. Okay, so I want to back up and maybe there we go. Talk a little bit about kind of why people get angry in the first place to kind of better understand what might be going on here. So this is my what I call my why we get mad model. It basically is you can think about it in terms of when you experience anger, what's all coming together to lead to that experience. And you can think about this in terms of some, you know, recent event. You know, driving is a nice one. So if you, I've said this before, but if you're an evil genius and you wanted to create a situation that was going to make people angry, you would create a situation that looked like driving. It's like the perfect scenario for making people mad. And it's because, so, you know, when you're driving, there's some sort of, you encounter a lot of provocations, a lot of stimuli, a lot of things that happen that, you know, that you interpret as anger. You know, slowdowns, bad weather, traffic, poor drivers, things like that. So some sort of stimulus, some sort of thing that happens. I mentioned those three categories and we'll talk about these more, but injustice, poor treatment, goal blocking, those are some of the primary drivers of anger. But you've all probably at some point had an experience where a thing that happened to you that normally would make you really, really angry didn't make you angry in that moment, or vice versa is probably more common, right? Normally this thing wouldn't bug you, but for whatever reason that day it really, really bugged you. And that is because, it could be a couple things, but it oftentimes has to do with your mood at the time you experience it. And I'm defining mood very broadly. I mean, like, are you sleep deprived? Are you hungry? Are you physically uncomfortable? Are you already like really stressed? Are you anxious or anything like that? Like what's going on there, right? All this other stuff. And those two things collectively come together and you know, the truth is, you know, provocations aren't necessarily very often inherently provoking. It's how you interpret them that makes them provoking. So you have to decide that this is an injustice. You have to decide that it's goal blocking. You have to decide that it's poor treatment. But you interpret this thing as, I guess, in one of those ways. And we're going to say more about appraisal in a second. But there's different ways that you can appraise these different situations. And then it is from that that you actually have this feeling of anger. And yeah, go ahead.
Could you just explain the difference between annoyance and anger?
Sure.
I think I get annoyed about 15 times a day, but I get really.
Totally.
Well, you know, my phone doesn't work, my computer's busted, you know, da.
Yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
Could you explain the difference between?
Yeah. So yeah, so the question, thanks. The question is, can you explain the difference between annoyance and anger? And, you know, it's a good question, and honestly, kind of a hard one. Like, I think most of the time what we would say is anger is a continuum. On one end, you've got sort of mild frustration, maybe you'd have annoyance there. And then on the other end, you've got like being livid with rage, right? And it's this broad continuum. This is, I say it's a good but complicated question because this is something psychologists, of course, probably unnecessarily like to tease out and sort of what is, you know, when does one emotion become another one? When should we say, you know what, annoyance is actually different than anger, or and so on. And I don't know that there's because the truth is these things are, even though I think it's important to sort of talk about them the way we are, but they oftentimes they don't occur in a vacuum, right? We feel lots of things at the same time. We're angry at the same time, we're sad, we're angry at the same time, we're scared. We can even be angry and happy at the same time, right? And so I shouldn't say this. I really am a Bucks fan, but I'm also a Minnesota Timberwolves fan. Cause I'm from Minnesota, and I took my son to the game on whatever night, it was also a Timberwolves fan. And we had an absolute blast. We were having a great time. I don't know if you saw how that game ended. Yep, it was rough. And it was such a weird moment for me too, because I truly, like, one of the happiest days I've had in the last 5 years was when the Bucks won the championship a few years ago. I am a Bucks fan, but just that night I wasn't. And it was such a weird position to be in. But anyways, angry and happy at the same time because I was with my son and we were having a blast. But yeah, it was devastating. The woman next to me was not kind to me either. I cannot remember. Oh, it was, yeah, you're asking about, so I would argue that annoyance is probably on that same continuum, but on the far end. And so, but you're right. I mean, that might influence how you answer that survey, right? If you're thinking of it as being anger, then you might say, but many times a day, Dan. So from this feeling of anger is comes all those behaviors that we can do, right? And so when we're angry, we can, that's the point at which we might, yell, scream, give someone the finger, throw punches. It's also the point where we might start to problem solve. It's the point where we might start to, meditate or something like that. The other thing to note about this is that it isn't as linear as I shared, because this feeling of anger then becomes your pre-anger state for the next thing you encounter, right? And so if you're already angry about one thing and then you encounter another provocation, it builds upon it and builds upon it and builds upon it. So I bring this up because there's kind of two different parts of it. That appraisal process is really important for what we're talking about right now. So when it comes to the appraisal piece, there's lots of ways that we tend to appraise or interpret those types of stimuli, those provocations that lead to increased anger. So so a couple of common ones. Some people are just more likely to, they're what we call blame proneness. They're more likely to blame other people for things. Sometimes people have a habit of labeling, so they label situations or people in these really negative ways. If you're driving down the road and someone cuts you off, you might call them a total idiot. Now, at that point, you're actually probably responding to that label in your head, not who they are, not what might have happened, but that label of total idiot. And one of the things that makes driving such a difficult or such a bad place for anger is that you have no way to debunk that myth at that point, right? I mean, you don't know this person. You can't find out how smart they might be or how kind they might be or anything like that. You just know that they're a total idiot because of what they did. So these labels exacerbate things. So there's two parts of appraisal, though. There's what we call primary appraisal, which is when we encounter the stimulus and we decide things like, at the very start, we say, is this good or bad? And then we say, is this, blameworthy or punishable? Or blameworthy or not? Who's responsible? Should that person be punished? We do all of that stuff in that primary appraisal piece. The secondary appraisal part is where we evaluate our ability to cope with it. So it's like, how bad is this? Because I can encounter a situation and I can say, you know what? This person shouldn't have done this. That was bad. That was wrong. Blameworthy, all of that. But it's not that big a deal. And I don't get very mad. But if I encounter a situation and I think that was wrong, they shouldn't have done it, and the outcome is gonna be catastrophic to me, then I'm much more likely to get angry. And so what we call catastrophizing is another thought process that people have that tends to lead to increased anger. We decide this is the worst thing that can happen. And now it's just so catastrophic that we're seeing that. So this is where that entitlement plays a role. There we go. So what we see is that if we explore that entitlement piece a little more, what we're seeing is, I mean, for starters, entitlement is this belief that you are inherently deserving of something. You know, you deserve these privileges, you deserve this special treatment, you deserve these rewards, and they aren't necessarily things that you've earned. They're things that you want real bad and that you think you deserve. Oftentimes it's this expectations that other people should accommodate your needs, that other people should do the things you want them to do simply because of who you are. So some of the common ones here is, you know, things like, oh, I've worked here for 10 years, they owe me that, right? Or I was nice and I paid for dinner, so I deserve a second date, right? You know, I know people laugh, but that is my friends who are, you know, on dating apps, women who are on dating apps say they hear this all the time, that a person, because this person was, you know, they basically said, but I was so nice, why wouldn't I get a second date? And so, the I don't care how busy you are, I shouldn't have to wait. All right, those types of things. No, I'm gonna be honest, that one of the things that as I was working on this, and I wrote an article this week on entitlement, as I was writing it, one of the things that is tricky about this for me, is that I do believe people are owed things, right? I mean, I do think that, you know, I mean, I don't think people are owed a second date, I don't think they're owed a promotion, but I do think that like a question that like human beings deserve some sort of treatment, right? They deserve, I don't know where that threshold is, but I do believe that we should treat people with kindness, we should do all sorts of things. But here's the thing that kind of how I came up from that big question is that when people are entitled, rarely is their entitlement sort of internally consistent. And what I mean is this person who says I've worked here for 10 years, they owe me that promotion, probably wouldn't be okay with that promotion going to someone who'd worked there for 11 years, right? They wouldn't sit there and say, you know, someone who's been here longer than me deserves it first, right? That same person who says I was nice and paid for dinner, I deserve a second date, probably wouldn't just automatically give someone a second date because they were nice to them, right? They don't drop everything they're doing to take care of other people so they don't have to wait, right? That's oftentimes what we see with entitlement is that they deserve that special treatment. Other people don't deserve that same kind of treatment. So here's where it's going to feel shamey. Oh no, sorry, next slide is where it's going to be shamey. Again, trying to keep on your toes. So we talked about the 3 reasons people get angry, right? There's this sense of injustice is a biggie. There's poor treatment is the other one. And there's these blocked goals, or I didn't get what I want, or something like that. And what we see is that entitlement sets you up for unrealistic expectations in these things. And so when you feel or believe you're entitled to things, well, then regular treatment feels like poor treatment. Justice feels like injustice. You know, not getting what you wanted, not necessarily what you deserved, but what you wanted feels like a blocked goal. I can think about this, like, so I have 2 kids at 13 and 15, and they're improving. But the thing you hear from them all the time, or that I used to hear from all the time, is anytime they didn't get something they wanted, what do kids say when they don't get what they want? That's not fair, right? Because kids don't yet have a great sense of what fairness is and what fairness means, that it takes time to figure that out and to develop that. It also takes, it doesn't just develop on its own, it takes like intentionality. It takes someone teaching them and helping them see it. And I think that maybe too often what's happened is that we've got people who just haven't developed a real clear sense of fairness, like what fairness actually means. And they perceive actual fair treatment as unfairness or injustice. So, well, basically, it makes you more likely to perceive, if I could perceive one or more. Huh. Oh, yeah, so it makes it, sorry, I didn't write that very good. It makes it more likely to perceive, you know, to identify that stimulus as injustice, as poor treatment, as goal blocking. Okay, so here's the biggie. Are men actually more likely to have entitlement problems? Yes. This is, by the way, I'll tell you a funny story in a second, but there's lots of research on this, And in fact, there's so much research on it that now it's just a given that that is true. And the research is actually extending that to look at, okay, and so what does it mean that men are more likely to have entitlement problems? And so what we see across these studies, men consistently are found to have higher entitlement scores than women. What it actually ends up predicting, and this also plays a role in anger, so it predicts family labor distribution. So part of why men are oftentimes, and even still, less likely to engage in family and labor around the home is because they don't believe they have to. They don't believe they should. And so we consistently find, you know, that men believe that that's not their job. Even when they don't necessarily, even when they say on the one hand, no, I know it's my job, but then they don't actually know it's their job. Overtly sexist beliefs are driven by entitlement. So people who have higher scores on entitlement are more likely to engage and have these overtly sexist attitudes. As soon as I put this up here, I was like, you're gonna have to say this out loud, but people with entitlement problems are more selfish in the bedroom. And they believe that their own satisfaction is more important than their partner's satisfaction. And so it interferes there. And then their expectations of greater compensation. So when they apply for jobs, when they're negotiating things, they believe that they deserve more, and they're more likely to engage in those sort of higher compensation expectations. What that means, though, is so all of these things cause potential problems, relationship problems, and things like that. The other thing they do is all these things have an indirect effect on anger as well, right? Because if you expect greater compensation and you don't get it, it feels like an injustice. If you believe that you're more deserving of sexual pleasure than your partner and you don't get it, it feels unfair. If you if you believe that the dynamic in your family is that your partner should do most of the labor around the house, then when they want 50-50, it feels unfair. It feels like goal blocking. And so all of these things, which we know men are more likely to experience, they lead to increased anger in all of these different contexts. Okay, so I'm gonna share two more findings, and then I want to actually, where I want to talk the most is about solutions. Like, what do we do, right? If this really is the kind of crisis I believe it is, and I think it is, what do we do about it? But here's part of why I think it's a crisis. Men make up 80% of suicides in the United States. That's truly an extraordinary number. Now, there are some caveats here, and one of them is, it actually goes back to what we were talking about before with guns. Women actually tend to attempt suicide more regularly than men do, but men complete the suicide more often than women do. And probably the biggest reason for that, or one of the biggest reasons for that, is that they select more lethal means, right? So they oftentimes select a gun and are more likely to complete the suicide than women are. But regardless, this is a scary statistic. And the other piece of it that I think is so interesting is that only 13% of men have attended therapy in the last year. That's compared to 25% of women. So 1 in 4 women are going to therapy in a given year. About 1 in 9 men, 1 in 8 men are going to therapy in the last year. So where does that come from and how is this relevant? I would argue it's the result of kind of a tough it out culture. It's a result of a belief that, well, no, you tweak to show emotion. You gotta tough it out and you don't need that kind of help. It's a result of vulnerability being seen as weakness. It's a result of, I think, anger sometimes masking deeper feelings. Which we should talk about anger as a secondary emotion if people have questions or want to, but I think it's a really important thing to talk about. It is sometimes true, but anger masking these deeper feelings. It's a result of a lot of stigma around help seeking and the consequences of help seeking. It's also the result of emotional illiteracy. It's a result of people not necessarily having a really firm grasp of how emotions work and what emotions mean in all these different ways. So what do we do about it? If it is indeed a cultural crisis, there are some things that I think we should be doing in being much more intentional about. One of these is I think we need to normalize vulnerability as courage. And it's funny because this is actually, it's really easy. If people are scared to show their feelings, then by definition, showing your feelings is brave, right? Because what it means is you're doing something you're scared of. It's not at all complicated. And so we've got to normalize that opinion. We've got to normalize the fact that sharing your emotions or that kind of vulnerability is courage. I think we need to teach emotional literacy as a life skill. We need to help people recognize kind of how emotions work, where they come from. We need to help them learn to label them, help them understand the role they play in their lives, and so on. I think we need to encourage therapy as relatively routine. There is truth to the idea. One of the things that this is a little bit of a double-edged sword, because I do believe that's important. I also know that many areas do not have enough therapists to meet demand. And I think one of the challenges there too is that sometimes the therapists we do have end up being seen by people who don't need them as much as some people who can't get in to see them. And so I think we've got to try and figure out the best way to have the demand meet that need. I think we need to empathize, and this is why I started with this disclaimer, that this isn't intended to be a shaming post. It's not. Like I just said post, I didn't mean post, talk. There's a real problem here, and I think it's worth acknowledging that sometimes the angry people might not. So I've worked with a lot of angry clients. More often than not, now granted, these are the ones who are coming in for therapy. These are not monsters. They're potentially doing monstrous things. They're hurting people in their lives, but then they're sitting in my office crying about it, thinking about, I don't like this about myself. I want to be different, right? So I think that there's some room for empathy there. But I also think we need to challenge. And I think we need to acknowledge that just saying you're sorry isn't good enough, and that making an effort to be better is what's important. And I think we need to challenge a lot of the versions of anger that are out there. I think we need to challenge a lot of the version. I try and stay away from framing things at this point as like toxic masculinity. But I do think that there are versions of it that are a problem and that we need to challenge those. I think we need better role models. And I also think we need to actively try and undo the really toxic role models that are out there for men. The Andrew Tates, President Trump's, if I'm being honest, like the people who are really demonstrating bad, unhealthy forms of anger and doing so in a problematic way. I also think we need to make sure we're supporting victims of male anger. And I think that sometimes my worry whenever I do a talk like this is that the perception is that I'm not worried about the people who suffer, and that's not true. In fact, that's honestly the motivation. I'm gonna share one last story, if that's okay, and then we can just talk. So I was on a podcast, like the week after the election. And, it was interesting because the podcast, the host, and I didn't know this when I went on the show, and I think I would have gone regardless. I was really, really happy. He ended up, being just a phenomenal host, but he's a very, very, very conservative comedian. And, I went on the show. I was nervous about it because I just kind of didn't know what kind of questions he might ask, what he might say. And then, he was fantastic, like just the most sensitive, thoughtful, honest, vulnerable guy, really, really great. And the episode came out like the week after the election, and I'm in a gymnasium in Sheboygan for my son's soccer game. And a stranger comes up to me and says, "Hey, I just saw you on the Obot's podcast." And I said, "Oh, wow, that's cool, you know?" And he said, can we talk for a couple minutes? And I said, sure. We went and sat down, and he shared with me like that he's been dealing with anger his like whole life, and he's been trying to be a better stepfather to his stepson. And he's like, told me like, you know, it was so interesting listening to you talk, and that was such a fascinating episode and all this. And it was really like a really touching moment. You know, and I actually saw him. So it was a really touching moment where it meant a lot to me that this person cared. But here's the other two things I would say. One is, I don't think under normal circumstances, me and this person would have gotten along very well. I suspect, based on what I've kind of learned about, I've seen him at a couple other games since then. We ideologically are very different. I don't think if we met under different circumstances, we would have had the same kind of conversation. So it says something about kind of the inroads. You know, how do you engage in conversations with people, and you know, how do you start those, and how do you you know, how do you get there without having those potentially great conversations blocked, you know, right out of the gate. Then I saw him. I saw him at a later game, and he came up and talked to me again, and he said that he's been following me on social media, and that he bought one of my books or something like that. And it's like, he's just you know, it's been a rewarding, I don't want to call it a relationship because I think we've seen each other like 3 times, you know, but it's been a rewarding set of interactions for both of us. And it all happened because we sort of met in a middle ground that we probably wouldn't have been able to meet on otherwise. And so I think that's a thing I've been thinking about trying to figure out how do you do these things, especially when I'm still dealing with the fact that 85% of my followers are women, right? That men aren't necessarily interested. So I guess maybe a question I'll have for you all is, how do you get men interested in it? So that is all I've got.
All right, thank you. So we are recording this, and that's why I have this other microphone. So if you have a question, I will come to you with it. Rob.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think it's really a timely discussion. I wish there were thousands of people thinking about this. On point 2 on your list.
Oh, yep.
Do you know, is there any curriculum teaching emotional literacy? Is there any curriculum out there in any state that, in your opinion, will help drive things to be better?
Yeah, so I got my notebook out because I'm gonna write that down, and I'm gonna look for some. You know, I know that lots of schools are working on, I mean, they have that included in their curriculum, they have versions of it. I don't necessarily know what some of the ideal versions are. I think there's a couple things I would be interested in. First of all, I do think, and I'm doing a talk on this at the Mulva Center this summer, by the way, but I do think that the movie Inside Out actually kind of changed the landscape for how people understand emotions, and especially kids. So if you haven't seen that movie, I would recommend it. It's a Pixar movie. But part of what it does is it provides this, what I think is a wonderful metaphor for how emotions work. And it's rooted in, so the psychologist that consulted on that is a guy named Paul Ekman, who is really sort of the primary person when it comes to having studied emotion in the first place. So I do think that like things like that make a real big difference. I would actually love to see I'd love to see training or help parents better understand emotional literacy. I think it's in some ways it's too bad that it's not more, and maybe it's changed since my kids were little, like real little, but it's too bad that it's not more a part of like baby books and about how to help kids sort of develop those skills over time. But you're right. So I'm gonna write that down and make sure that I look for sort of what's some of the best curriculum that's out there.
I have two questions actually. So the first one is, what are tips on how we can support the victims of male anger with staying safe?
Yeah.
And then the second one is, what are skills that we could teach our kids to move forward? Because I have two kids, a 13-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old son. So the 9-year-old is really important to me to kind of teach both of them how to move forward as adults
Yeah.
better.
Yep. Yeah. So the tips on victims staying safe. I mean, that's one of the things that I think is really important, and it is really hard for me when I talk about it, because a big part of what I do is talk about how anger can oftentimes be healthy. The danger there, though, is I don't want anyone to think that I'm not understanding the very real consequences that can happen. I mean, I do believe that when people feel unsafe, or when people are unsafe, they need to get to safety, right? They need to, and so oftentimes I think, when dealing with angry people, it depends on like sort of a lot of the context of their anger. Meaning, if you are feeling physically unsafe, doing what you need to do to get to physical safety, like to get to safety. I do think a lot of times it's about making sure, when you're interacting with a person who's really angry, one of the best things you can do is your impulse is to raise your voice. Your impulse is to sort of yell back or fight back. It's called emotion matching, or it's sometimes called a complementary behavior, meaning you're complimenting what they're doing by doing it back to them. And what you want to do is embrace what's called a non-complementary response, which is to lower your voice. It's to try and be calm, because it helps bring other people down with you. And so that's a way of de-escalating things. To your question about your kids, I think there's a couple of things, especially when you're thinking, you said 9 and 11? 9 and 13, okay. I think that there's two things that I was saying. First is modeling, right? So showing kids how to express their emotions through your own mechanisms. And I think that's probably the most important thing people can do, is trying to make sure that they've got a good, healthy role model or multiple role models when it comes to expressing emotions. The other thing I think is making sure you're processing with them big emotional events. So if they do lose their temper, a lot of times we're quick to shame, and instead taking time to talk with them afterwards about what they were feeling and how they were feeling it, and try and have those like conversations with them to help them better understand. I mean, you probably know from your own experience, when you are angry, it's really hard to be reasonable, right? And so sometimes just having some time and being able to come back to that can be really helpful. I had a third thing. I really like reading, or when you're just watching TV or whatever, that when you read with your kids, when you watch television with them, trying to watch it through an emotional lens and to actually take time to ask questions like, how do you think they were feeling when that happened? That a big part of how emotional literacy happens is by like processing what you're seeing in the world around you. So trying to understand what people are. This is why I love airports. My poor kids, every time we're at an airport, they're excited to fly, but I like the people watching. And it's because super strong emotions at the airport, right? I mean, you've got people who are scared, you've got people who are sad because they're on their way home from somewhere or leaving a family member, you got people who are angry because the flight delayed, you got people who are excited because of where they're going, like tons to see. And so if you take time to actually point out those feelings to people, to your kids, it can be a good way to help them start to develop a lot of that. Asking, hypotheticals, what could they have done, things like that, how could they have expressed that? Those are, I think, all good ways.
If I can call back one thing we talked about last night, Ryan, in our affiliate faculty meeting was, for some of us, reading fiction helps create more nuance and also demonstrate changes of feeling, changes of opinion over time. We identify with characters. Some in our group are saying that good films do that for them as well. Whereas sometimes nonfiction or just the real life situations around us, we don't see the nuance and the shades of gray. So that reading a great book can sometimes help us see the development of a character in a very positive way. And just one very quick shameless plug, we'll talk after. My daughter-in-law writes young adult and children's fiction for just that reason. So, other questions?
Real quick, I wanted to come back to a question before when you asked about curriculum that's really valuable. One of the things we know is that what actually does a lot of good emotional intelligence work is the arts. And so kids who engage in theater, for the exact reason, I mean, it's about perspective taking, it's about empathy, it's about learning to think about things from other people. All of those things are developed through art classes. And so we know that kids who engage in the arts that way oftentimes have a healthier emotional life.
Thank you for your talk so far. It's been excellent, helpful for me. The reason that I came is that I'm not representing my employer, but I see the results of male anger on a regular basis. And the thing that struck me most of many of the great points that you made, was that how can we get the help to the men who most need it, who are most likely to cause damage in society. And so I kind of was likening it to, like if you don't have money for dental care, the Dental Association offers periodic free care for the poor. And free legal services have been available for a long time. And others, even in housing, there's housing where you can have desirable locations, and there's some low-income housing within desirable locations. Is there any movement amongst the professionals to offer support to these folks? Often the victims can get help for free, but not necessarily the perpetrators.
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, none that I know of. And in fact, it's in some ways it's even worse than that, because what often happens is when a person is found guilty of an anger-related crime in some way, they might be sentenced, quote unquote, to anger management treatment, but it's typically on their own dime. And so anger management treatment ends up being a punishment on top of whatever other punishment that they got. And so ultimately, in circumstances like that, it's unlikely to work on top of everything else. So, right, if you're not necessarily interested in it, or I shouldn't say unlikely, less likely, I think, to work if you're seeing it as an additional consequence or additional punishment. And so, yeah. Yes, I mean, I am intrigued by anything that will help get angry men in the door, right? That, quite honestly, and here's the other thing I would say is I just finished the show last night, honestly, because I thought people were gonna ask me about it, so I stayed up super late and finished it. So somebody's gotta ask me. But I just finished the show Adolescence last night on Netflix. That's what you're gonna ask? Yes. It was time well spent. I will just tell you, I'm obsessed with this show, so anyone who wants to talk about it, I'm on board. Why did I bring it up though? The thing that I keep coming back to is, I look around the world right now, and I see a lot of young men who want things, right? The things that they think they're entitled to. They want good jobs, they want dates, they want friends, they want all of these things. Their anger is actually preventing them from getting those things. And so if you want those things, then do the work, right? And so part of me wants to say, like, we can solve two problems here. We can solve the fact that you're not getting the things you want, and, which I know is entitlement, and we can help address this problem. But we need you to sort of be willing to do the work to get there. And that's the part that I'm sort of stuck with, is trying to figure out how we convince people of that there's good opportunity there for you. You just need to be willing to kind of work through and do some real work there.
Two things. One, I wonder, is there a domestic violence court, like we have drug court and teen court? Do we have in our community? Because that would certainly be inappropriate use of our judicial resources to do intervention.
I'm seeing some shaking heads, so I assume that's no.
No.
Okay.
That's unfortunate. And my other thing is, in regard to what you just said, I have a saying that nobody gets up in the morning and said, boy, I can't wait to screw my life up today.
Right.
And people say, if they only made good decisions, if people know how to make the decisions, they make good decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is the same thing with anger. We need to, and just with what you were saying about people need to move themselves forward, but a lot of times they just don't know how to do it.
Right.
And how do we start that process with particularly young adolescents, I think?
Mm-hmm.
So what would be good?
Yeah, you're right, and I don't. This is why. So there are a billion problems. There are a billion factors right now that are making it harder for people, for kids to grow up in a healthy way that allows them to grow up into men or women who can make good decisions right now. There are a billion factors, right? Social media is driving all sorts of problems. Economic uncertainty is driving a billion problems. Media, role models. I mean, there's so many factors that are making it difficult, and I don't know how you undo those things, especially when I think the people who can best undo those things are also overtaxed, right? I mean, we've got parents who are working multiple jobs, and it's harder to do some of the things they need to do. We've got school teachers who are overtaxed. So you just put all that together, and it feels like the challenges. I realize how unbelievably negative I sound right now, but I don't know how you can try and move, because honestly, one of the problems I have is that working with young men, and it's not too late, but it's harder, right? It would be easier if we were able to have these interventions happen earlier. That's why I loved your question so much about curriculum. What are the things we can be doing? I think it starts with us shifting our perception to recognize that this is important, and that we need to start there and do something about it. I do too. I was never this way before. I am becoming more and more certain we need to have, and I don't know what any of these things look like because I'm not a legal scholar, but I do think we need to do something about regulating social media. It's a bad situation for a lot of people, and it's hard. It's really, really hard. As a father of a 13 and 15-year-old, it's really hard to manage it internally. So.
When you're talking about entitlement, it occurred to me that some who are most entitled in the ways that you were describing are also big critics of what they perceive to be other people's entitlement. Yeah. And it makes me wonder if that might not be a way in, to think about what is it that we are entitled to in society? What do we promise to each other? And what must we work for? Those might be some of the questions that could start to crack some of those barriers. Another question. Yeah.
I don't want to sound like Pollyanna. Ooh, I'm loud. Your story about that gentleman that you met 3 different times that heard you on your podcast, it's going to be those subtle inroads that we make with people. None of this is going to come overnight. We didn't get here overnight, and it's not going to go away overnight, but we all have gifts and talents where we can, like they say, shine the light for people, because sometimes there's a lot of people that are running around and their world is dark. So if you can shine the light just a little bit to people, and I know exactly how you're feeling, because I'm doing the same thing, like, okay, what can I do to make the world a better place? What can I do to get rid of this so much anger that people are carrying around? What can I do to make the world a more joyful place? I think we all have gifts and talents we can share, but none of this is gonna come overnight, but it will be those teeny tiny inroads that we make, and oh my gosh, we made a difference in somebody's life. I mean, you think about that man and you made a difference, and you didn't think, you're on completely different sides of the page, but you made a difference.
I think, thank you for saying that. That means a lot. I will say honestly, I think for me, going on that show, which I will, the funny backstory here is that this person, Theo Von, asked me to come on his show, I had never heard of him, which I don't know, how many of you have heard of him? Okay, so a handful. His name's Theo Von, and I learned afterward he's Rolling Stone's 10th most influential person this year, but I didn't know this when he asked. So my assistant actually he emailed her, and she said you need to go do this, and so I went on the show, but I started listening to him first, and I got really scared because his humor is relatively offensive. And not just, offensive in a lot of ways. And I started thinking, I don't know that I want to do this. Like, is he going to ask me tough questions? Not tough questions. I'm comfortable with those, but is he going to ask me inappropriate questions? And so I finally decided, no, I need to do this, and I'm convinced it's maybe the best thing that I've ever done. And I say that because because he was a truly great host. 2, because I think it gave me inroads into that community that I wouldn't have been able to get otherwise. That his audience is a much more conservative young male audience. No one else in my family had heard of him except for my 2 nephews, who are both college-age men, and so it was like, for that reason, I think and so honestly, not that I could do something like that regularly, but that would be a much more like a thing I would like to do more often.
I'm curious, we live in a time of rising wealth inequality, and that would contribute to perceptions of injustice and entitlement. One explanation I've seen for the election has a lot to do with that, the perception of loss that folks are feeling. And that men are feeling maybe not necessarily more acutely because they've lost more, but because they perceive they've lost more falling from a place of previously more privilege.
Yeah.
Did you collect any demographic data in your surveying on wealth, on other demographics, things that would point to that type of relationship? Or just what are your perceptions on it?
Yeah, that is a great question. And so I'm thinking through the survey right now, trying to remember if I asked anything about, I do ask a number of demographic questions. I'm trying to remember, I mean, I ask political persuasion, but I'm trying to remember if there's anything about wealth, and I'm not sure if there is, but it'd be an interesting question to go back and analyze. I think the things you're describing influence this model in a couple of different ways. And I think because I think it influences appraisal in all these ways, because when you encounter a provocation, you make a lot of quick judgments about the people or person involved. And so how you perceive them as similar or different from you, how you perceive them as, like what kind of car they're driving, all those things influence the anger in that moment. I also think, we're in sort of a constant state of stress right now. And I think political uncertainty, I think economic uncertainty, I think those things drive a lot of stress that leads to us being more likely to have these kind of negative emotions in the moment, being a little more high strung. I had a thought and now it escaped me, but it's gonna come back to me, I promise. I just have to think about something else for a little while. Yes.
Okay, I'll jump in with another one real quick then. So Adam Novotny is here, who is, if I get the title correct, Director of the Office of Student Engagement. He's a director, he says he's assistant. I wonder, Adam, if I can put you on the spot, and as you're working with so many young men and women on campus, how is this connecting with your experience?
Well, thank you, especially for the director title. I haven't earned it, but I appreciate it. So I've been fortunate to be at UW Green Bay for now 12 years and be in a few different roles. I started in housing, now I'm in student activities, and so with that, we've seen a lot of students come through, and I think it's quite the microcosm just for everything. When you bring these individuals in together in housing, seeing it be in roommate conflicts that come about with students who maybe don't know much about each other, and then it's whether or not they're trying to take that time to actually work through those issues, or if it's just resulting in keeping things down, and then where that anger kind of comes through, if it just reaches that boiling point. And even now in the activities, we see that with our students within their student organizations, and they have a leader who's the president, but then there starts to be people who are like, well, they're not doing what we want them to do, and we need to get them out of power. And seeing that, like, even on this level at UW Green Bay, and I think too, I'll say there's an app out there. I don't know if it'll ring true for a number of people in this crowd, but it's called Yik Yak. And so that is an app where students, they're here, they're part of UW Green Bay, and they can just post anonymously. Their name isn't there, no one knows that it's them. And so that is typically used as a place to really share anger about things. Typically it's either housing or dining or those pieces. So we definitely feel that sense of entitlement even from students of the Wi-Fi is not working, I am entitled to this because I am paying for this here at this school, or even an event, if we run out of something, sometimes, not often, students will come upset about that, but there's times when even it's something like that where they feel I am a student here, I deserve to have this, and it's kind of just helping them realize and maybe reframing some of that, what you're talking about, of what that really means and what they are entitled to, and helping reframe that as well, just even from that student perspective. Because of course, our whole goal is that they leave their time here at UW Green Bay and they're that great citizen who can do those things going forward. So we definitely get that time, but I could see some of the struggles where they're coming in and they haven't heard some of the things and been faced with learning some of those pieces that we want them to.
I remember what I was going to say before. one of the things that we were dealing with a lot right after the pandemic was just all these instances of violence that were happening, right? So, flight attendants were getting punched in the face, and I think there were 2 instances of flight attendants being punched, and one losing teeth. There were all of the school fights, the road rage shootings, all that stuff was on the increase, and it clearly anger problems driving it, but honestly, in some ways, what it really felt like to me at the time, and I think it's been exacerbated, I think it's related to your question, is I think sometimes it's not so much an anger problem as it is an animosity problem. Americans don't like each other very much right now. And I think we're seeing a lot of that playing out in a lot of different circumstances where people are just, they're angry with one another in advance of any kind of provocation. And I think it's rooted in some of the uncertainty a lot of people are experiencing. I think it's rooted in wealth disparities. I think it's rooted in political strife. I think at the time it was really rooted in one of the things Americans may have learned during the pandemic is that regardless of kind of how you felt about some of the things that were happening, right, about mask rules and stuff like that, regardless of how you felt about it, I think a lot of Americans came out of that thinking, I can't trust my fellow Americans to take care of me. I can't trust them to care about my health. I can't trust them to care about my economic certainty. I can't trust them. And I think that is a wound that just hasn't healed yet, and continues to drive a lot of things. And I think some really, really polarizing elections since then has continued to drive that. And I think that and so to me, those wounds just aren't healing, and they're driving a lot of this. Yeah.
One more back here. I think we'll make this the last one.
It's a lot of pressure.
If a student at this campus reaches out maybe to you or to this gentleman over here or somewhere, are the resources adequate in your opinion on this campus to help that student that has anger problems, that is recognizing it and looking for help?
Adam, do you mind taking that? Yeah, I'm curious to, because Adam works more directly in that area. Do you feel like it's adequate?
Yeah. Sorry to get us back. No, absolutely. I would say yes. I feel that as a staff, as faculty, we're very well trained on being able to help our students get connected to those resources, and we've been growing, I would say, in our wellness center and our counseling services that would be able to help address with students, to be able to kind of initiate and start talking through those things. So I would say yes, that at least to be able to get them in for those initial things, and then if it's beyond their scope, I would think that they'd be able to get that out into some different community resources if that would be necessary. But I think definitely we have the people in place to be able to help those students when or if they do come forward and talk to us.
But whenever a politician asks if you have enough resources, the right answer is usually, we're doing great, but we could do even better.
Yeah. No, I do think to build off what Adam said, I think faculty know what to do and the staff know what to do and where to direct people. I think the university's done a really good job of making sure people feel comfortable connecting students to the resources they need. I mentioned. I do think, this isn't a statistic, a UWGB statistic, it's a national statistic, but the number one cause of college dropout right now is mental health concerns. And so it's something like 1 in 4 students will consider dropping out over mental health concerns. And so, there's clearly a need for those kinds of resources. Clearly a need to try and address it. Now, that's not specific to anger. I do also think, I will say, and I can't speak to, and I trust that the people we hire at UWGB are pretty great. I do think that a lot of therapists, this is a whole nother talk, we don't have time for it today, But I will just tell you that I think the field of the study of anger has gotten far less attention than some other negative emotions. And so a lot of times therapists report not feeling as comfortable talking about anger as they are depression, as they are anxiety, or other feeling states. And so that's got to be part of the solution too, is to address that stuff.
So, is there anything we didn't ask that you were hoping we would, or anything you'd like to leave us with? This is terrific.
We didn't talk about adolescence.
Can I just ask, if you can explain to some that may not know what we're talking about?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just quickly say, this is me just pitching for Netflix right now. So just Adolescence is this relatively new show, I think, or it's a limited series on Netflix. It's 4 episodes. It is about a young boy in England who commits a crime, and it's about the aftermath of that crime, including for the next, basically on his family, his experience with it in his school, and so forth. It is, in my opinion, a masterfully done show. I mean, just absolutely spectacular. One of the things I will say, but part of what's happening here is that this is a person, I don't think this is much of a spoiler, but this is a boy who's been sort of radicalized by social media and by the quote-unquote manosphere. He's been following the wrong role models, and it's exacerbated how he's interacting with people in his life. And I'll just tell you, one of the things that's really amazing about this show is that every episode is filmed in real time and in one take. So there's no editing. They filmed every episode. They filmed each one 10 times, and then they just picked the best of the 10, or approximately 10 times. Anytime someone screwed up a line, they either just kept it in if it was a minor screw up, or they just said, whoop, we're done, start again. So each episode is an hour long. This includes car rides where the camera person gets in the car. It's the most fascinating thing I've ever seen. So truly just incredible. Did that do it justice? Can we talk more after?
Ryan, this was great. Thank you. Thank you very much for doing this. Thank you. Appreciate it so much. So we were recording this tonight, and so if you have friends or you'd like to come back and look at it yourself, and if you have friends you want to recommend it to, we'll have it up on our website within a few days once we do. Pardon me?
Monday.
Well, Monday, sometime after Monday. So we can do a little bit of editing on that. We also have back in the back, as you exit, there's a QR code there that we're trying to solicit some feedback every now and then. And so if you want to scan that QR code and give us a little bit of feedback on what I think has been just a terrific conversation, please do that for us. Also on April 22nd, we have something big coming here, and I really hope you come back and join us. So we have Aziz Abusara and Megan Inom. Aziz is a Palestinian peacemaker who lost his brother to Israeli police violence probably 2 decades ago. And then on October 7th, 2023, Hamas attacked Israel in multiple places. The parents of Megan Inon were murdered in their kibbutz. Aziz knew the family and reached out to Megan's brother Maoz, and they began conversations. And they took that conversation public in a TED Talk that was the 3rd most watched TED Talk last year. They were invited by the Pope to do a public conversation event with him. And they've been all over the world with these conversations of an Israeli and a Palestinian discussing the prospect of peace and what it looks like to seek peace together rather than revenge. And I just strongly encourage you to be back for that 7 o'clock on April 22nd. and to bring your friends. That's going to be a special evening. And this was a special evening. Thank you so much for coming.